Hey guys, tonight we're travelling back to a long wooden table in a cold, smoky hall, where even the way you lift your hand could get you in trouble. You're at the edge of a medieval feast, and the rules here, they're ancient. You won't believe what's hiding behind a simple gesture like which hand you use to eat. Alright, before you get too cozy, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe, but only if your heart says yes. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. Always love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Dim the lights, get that fan going for some background vibes, and let's chill into tonight's little adventure. You've just sat down to a long trestle table in a candlelit manor hall. There's bread, stale but hearty, and slices of cured meat, hard cheese, and a pitcher of watered-down ale. Around you, people chatter in hushed tones, laughing just enough to stay polite. But the mood shifts when you reach out with your left hand. Someone across the table freezes mid-bite. A younger maid's eyes dart to the steward. You don't know what you've done, but they do. In medieval Europe, the use of the right hand wasn't about politeness. It was a rule of survival. Right hands were visible, predictable. Left hands, suspicious. For one, they were considered unclean. Washing was rare, and people use their left hands for tasks that no one at this table wants to think about while chewing mutton. But the deeper reason, the one no one says out loud, is poison. Poisoning wasn't folklore, it was strategy. From rival lords to angry cousins, slipping something fatal into a cup was one of the quietest ways to end a dispute. And so, trust began with the hands. Right hand visible, right hand used. Always. Because if your left hand dipped below the tablecloth, who knew what it might be doing? In wealthier households, the paranoia was even worse. Nobles sometimes drank only after a servant or a dog had sipped first. The person pouring the wine was watched, and the hand they used, that mattered. Pouring with the left hand could be enough to have you dismissed, or worse, investigated. Some households even banned left-handed servants altogether. This custom bled into law and ritual. In public ceremonies, legal oaths had to be made with the right hand. Guild initiations, hand-fasting weddings, knightly pledges, all done with the same arm. Not because the right hand was magical, but because it was visible, contained, defensible, and because everyone feared what might be hidden in the other one. You're beginning to understand now. As you quickly switch your spoon to your right hand, you catch the steward giving you a slow, approving nod. Crisis averted. No dungeon tonight. You chew slower now. Careful to keep your right hand on the table in full view of the others. You notice they're doing the same. Elbows tucked, forearms resting neatly by their trenchers. No one says a word about your earlier misstep, but you can feel it. How easily suspicion forms in a room like this. The fear of poisoning wasn't limited to kings and queens. It trickled down into the halls of minor lords, merchant households, even monastic communities. All it took was a whispered rumour, a strange illness after supper, and the whole household could descend into hushed glances and sudden firings. In some towns, apothecaries were required to log the sale of certain herbs, not for health, but because too many digestive tonics had been turning up in wine goblets. But it wasn't only poison people feared. The left hand became a symbol of all that was hidden, reversed, or unpredictable. In medieval combat, striking from the left was considered cowardly. In art, the devil often lurked to the left of saints. Even the Latin word sinistra, the root of sinister, tells you exactly how people felt about it. The consequences of using the wrong hand could be long-lasting. Children caught favouring their left were corrected, sometimes gently, sometimes with force. In noble families, left-handed heirs were viewed with concern, as if their very bodies might threaten the harmony of inheritance. Some were quietly retrained, others simply learned to hide their natural instincts. And still, there were exceptions. In a few northern towns, local superstition flipped the rule. Left-handedness was seen not as evil, but as a mark of cleverness, someone who could think sideways. Some hedge healers and midwives quietly favoured their left, especially when working with herbs or charms. But they did so in private, behind doors, away from dinner tables and watchful eyes. Tonight, as the meal draws to a close, the rules remain unspoken but deeply felt. You've learned the rhythm of it now. Every movement, how you break bread, how you pass the salt, is watched, mimicked, absorbed into a pattern that's existed for generations. And as you wipe your mouth with the coarse cloth provided, you see it clearly. This isn't about manners. It never was. It's about power, trust, and fear. And in this world where loyalty shifts like wind through stone corridors, even the smallest gesture, like which hand you use, can whisper something dangerous. You rise from the table, right hand still resting near your belt, palm up. It's not a sign of peace. It's just how things are done here. You're outside now, under a sky the colour of old pewter, standing at the edge of a narrow path. It's not paved, just hardened earth worn by generations of feet. As you prepare to walk, something odd happens. A woman ahead of you steps carefully, deliberately, making sure her first foot forward is her right. Then the man behind her does the same. You pause. Is this just habit? A game? Or something deeper? In the medieval world, the direction of your steps mattered, sometimes more than the destination itself. The right side, again, represented purity, blessing, the known. The left, on the other hand, belonged to the unpredictable. And so, walking rituals quietly formed in daily life. When entering a new house or stepping onto a sacred road, leading with your right foot was believed to protect you from misfortune, but it wasn't always about superstition. In many towns, foot traffic was highly ritualized, especially during festivals, market days, or religious processions. People weren't just wandering. They were moving in precise patterns, often in clockwise circles mimicking the sun. This circular movement wasn't random. It was thought to draw in luck and keep malevolent forces at bay. Forces that, according to belief, only travelled in straight lines or entered from the left. Even the entrances of homes, castles, and town halls were designed with movement in mind. Spiral staircases almost always turned clockwise as they rose, giving defenders, typically right-handed swordsmen, the upper hand against intruders charging upward. That meant if you were the one invading, you'd be forced to fight awkwardly with your left. It was a world where even walking had a strategic and symbolic direction. You start down the path, mimicking the others, right foot forward, head low. There's something oddly comforting about it, like slipping into a rhythm older than memory, a pattern passed down not in books but in bones. Then you come to a crossroads. Here, the customs shift. You've heard whispers that at forks like this, the left path tempts you. It's often prettier, softer, quieter. But in many villages, people avoided it, not because it was harder, but because it was believed to lead to crooked places. The kinds of places where strange lights were seen at night, where animals acted oddly, and where crops failed for no reason. Instead, the right-hand path, though rockier, was trusted. It was thought to follow older trade routes or safer ground. Parents told children, if you're lost, always turn right, because the left, well, the left might lead you somewhere you don't come back from. And so, even in something as simple as walking, the world whispered rules. Step by step, you begin to understand. This isn't just about direction. It's about signalling who you are, which forces you trust, which you fear. And as your foot lifts again, you make your choice, knowing the land is watching. You follow the right-hand path, feeling the incline grow steeper as the landscape narrows into hedgerows and mossy stones. Behind you, a few others have made the same choice. Whether out of belief or custom, you can't say. But no one dares the left trail. Not tonight. Soon you spot a small stone marker, half buried, with a faint spiral carved into it, clockwise just like the festival routes. You'd almost miss it if you weren't paying attention. In medieval life, these subtle markers were everywhere, at crossroads, at the edges of fields, near rivers. They were placed not to direct travellers like signs today, but to bind space to memory. The shape of the mark told you not just where to go, but how to walk it. Clockwise was the pattern of the sun, the pattern of sanctity. counterclockwise. That was for undoing things, breaking circles. It was how curses were cast, how spells were reversed. If a procession moved the wrong way around a church, people whispered of death in the village within a week. These weren't isolated superstitions. They were embedded in public life. In some guilds, apprentices had to walk clockwise around the hall before being sworn in. In seasonal fairs, dancing in the wrong direction could bring a fine or a scolding from the elders. Even graveyards had rules. You entered from the east, walked around the church sunwise, and never, not ever, walked against the sun's arc when passing a burial. And if you did, some believed it woke the spirits. You stop at a bend in the path where the stones are slick with moss, and a hollow tree leans low over the way. A younger boy travelling near you touches the tree's bark with his right hand and mutters something under his breath. You do the same, though you don't know why. Just instinct. Turns out many trees were believed to harbour memory. Some marked borders between villages or parishes. Others, like twisted oaks and ash trees, were seen as anchors between worlds. And touching them with your right hand, that was a way of showing respect, of asking permission, of not walking blindly into trouble. By the time the path opens into a field, the sky has darkened to ink. You've walked perhaps a mile, but it feels longer. Every step has been layered with meaning, one you didn't know when you left the hall. You're not just walking forward anymore, you're moving within a map of beliefs, a pattern your feet seem to recognize even if your mind doesn't, and maybe that's the strangest part. This world is built on invisible lines, the left and right of things, the way the sun moves, the way people cross thresholds and turn corners. Every step, every gesture is loaded with silent intention. And those who ignore it, they might never notice what they've broken, but you do. As you pass a second spiral marker, you feel a calm settle in your chest. Not because you're safe, but because you've listened, and the land, it seems, is listening back. You wake to the sound of hooves outside your chamber window, wooden wheels creaking, a muffled shout from a porter below. Morning light spills in through the shutters, catching the edge of your linen tunic and the worn buckle of your belt. It's market day, and with it comes a small but peculiar dilemma. What to wear? Not just colour or fabric, but how. Because in this world your clothing speaks. Every stitch, every fold, every pin is part of a quiet language. A system of meaning people have learned to read without ever being taught. You pull on a long tunic and reach for your belt. Here's where it gets interesting. In medieval Europe, tying your belt too high, above the waist, was often associated with the clergy or penitents. Too low, and you risked looking like a drunk or a libertine. The proper place, across the hips, with the end of the strap hanging down to the left. Not the right, always the left. Why? Because the left side, though shunned in some customs, was the side of the heart. Letting your belt tail fall leftward was believed to signal honesty, openness, even fertility. In some regions, unmarried men let the strap hang longer, signalling their eligibility. And for women, the placement of the belt, especially if they were expecting, shifted deliberately to showcase or conceal the curve of a belly. You finish dressing, running your hands over the folds to smooth them, but even that action, how you smooth your tunic, is watched. Upward motions are considered vain, downward ones humble. Too quick, and you seem flustered. Too slow, and someone might think you're hiding a knife. And speaking of knives, you reach for yours, a small eating dagger with a carved handle, and place it at your belt. But here comes the tricky part, the angle. Letting it hang straight was considered respectable, practical. But tilt it too far forward, and people might read it as aggressive. Too far back, and it looks like you're hiding something. It's a strange ballet of intention and appearance, because in a society with limited reading, no selfies and no legal IDs, people read what they could. Posture, accessories, fabric, motion. Even laces and buttons carried messages. Sumptuary laws in places like England and France restricted who could wear certain colours, furs and embroidery. Gold thread might be forbidden to anyone below a knight. Buttons shaped like animals or mythic beasts were associated with certain guilds or stories. Some people wore them for protection, others as quiet rebellion. Today, you fasten a single clasp at the shoulder. It's a small thing, but you've chosen it deliberately. A tiny pewter brooch shaped like a bird, wings outstretched. In this town, it marks you as someone who's travelled. A nod to distant roads and languages spoken badly. It also might get you better prices from foreign traders, assuming they believe you. And just before leaving your chamber, you pause at the mirror. Not the glass kind, but a polished metal disc hung on the wall. You don't smile into it. No one does. In some villages, showing teeth to your own reflection was said to invite mockery from spirits. Instead, you nod once, steady your expression, and step out into the street. Already your clothes are speaking before you've said a word. The market hums with movement. Cartwheels grinding against stone, chickens squawking under crates, a lute player strumming something vaguely off-key near the well. And as you walk through it all, you notice something you hadn't before, how everyone's outfit is telling a story. A woman near the spice stall wears her sleeves tied back with crimson ribbons, bright red, but not dyed too deeply, suggesting she bought from a local dyer rather than an imported cloth merchant. Still, that pop of colour hints at boldness. Maybe she's recently widowed, or maybe she just wants people to think she is. A young boy sprints past, shirt untucked, belt askew, hair flopping over one eye. No one scolds him, but several adults shake their heads with quiet disapproval. In a town like this, even children are expected to maintain a certain visual rhythm. Clean lines, tight lacing, properly fastened boots. Sloppiness signals neglect, or worse, poor upbringing. At the edge of the square, a baker's apprentice stands proudly in a flour-dusted apron. But you notice the subtle detail. His sleeves are rolled unevenly, left elbow exposed, right elbow covered. That's not just habit. In some towns, it's a nod to superstition, that the right arm, the one used for offering goods, should remain concealed so no bad luck can cling to the act. You pause at a stall selling combs and ribbons. A mirror-polished tray of pewter clasps gleams in the light. The vendor, a short woman with sharp eyes and sharper wit, catches your gaze. "Looking for favour or function?" she asks, not unkindly. It's a fair question. In medieval towns, how you fasten your cloak could mean everything. A brooch on the right shoulder, martial pride, the left, romance, dead centre, near the throat, spiritual devotion, or vanity, depending on how ornate the clasp. You pick up a small brass pin shaped like a stag. The vendor watches silently. "You from the east?" she asks after a moment. You blink. "What gave me away?" She gestures, not to your face, but your waist. That knot in your belt. Northern travellers tie left under right. Yours runs the other way. Old habit, maybe. You nod, suddenly aware of how closely you're being read. Because in this world, fashion isn't just aesthetics, it's intelligence gathering. Your belt, your boots, your clasp, even your hat, if you'd worn one. They tell people where you're from, what you value, how you see yourself. Are you humble? Are you wealthy? Are you pretending? And the most unexpected part. This silent language was more widely understood than any written script. Most villagers couldn't read Latin, but everyone could read a hemline, a fabric choice, a dye. The vendor smiles as if confirming her theory and slides the brass stag into a wrap of linen. You hand over a coin and tuck the brooch into your satchel. As you walk away, you catch your reflection in a water bucket, a blur of motion, colour and shadow. You think back to this morning. How long you stood by the mirror, how carefully you adjusted the belt. Now you understand why. You weren't just getting dressed. You were writing your first sentence of the day. It starts with a knock. You've barely begun your midday bread when the knock echoes again. 3 slow raps on wood. That rhythm, deliberate and low, means it's not family. It's someone official. You rise, wipe your hands, and lift the latch. A man stands at your door wearing a leather pouch across his chest, a wax tablet in one hand, and a thin strip of folded parchment in the other. His boots are caked in road dust, and a seal dangles from his belt, carved with the town's crest. Without waiting for invitation, he steps inside and hands you the folded parchment. "Summoned," he says, "for witness." Your mouth goes dry, not because you're guilty of anything, but because being summoned rarely ends well. What follows is a slow walk through town, past the market, past the green, to a small stone building near the old churchyard. The place is quiet, but the smell of ink and mildew hovers in the air like a shadow. You're led to a bench, and across from you sits a scribe, one of the few people in town who can read and write more than his name. Next to him, the reeve, a sharp-eyed man in a brown cloak, taps a stylus against his knee. The scribe looks up. "Speak carefully," he says. "Words become record." That's the moment you realise something strange about this world. In medieval society, most people never leave behind a written trace. No journals, no love letters, no personal notes. Even land deeds are rare, often oral, or burned in the next fire. But court records, witness statements, these stay, and they are terrifyingly final. You're asked to describe what you saw 2 nights ago, something about a scuffle between neighbours, someone yelling near the alehouse. You recount it plainly, but the scribe pauses you midway. Did he raise his right hand or his left? You blink. I don't remember." He writes something down anyway. The reeve doesn't nod, doesn't speak, just studies you. Because in a world with no cameras, no voice recordings, no fingerprints, the spoken word is currency. And that makes gesture everything. If a man raises his right hand while swearing, it signals truth. If he scratches his beard while speaking, it might imply a lie. Covering the mouth, blinking too much, shifting weight, these are all clues not to emotion but to guilt or innocence. Some reeves and bailiffs train themselves to watch these signs like hawks, catching the things left unsaid. And if someone gestures too much with their left hand, well, remember what we said about the left. Even the phrasing matters. To say, "I saw him strike," is different from "I believe he struck." One is witness, the other, hearsay, and hearsay could cost you. In the worst cases, it could be called perjury. That's why, as you speak, you keep your hands still on your knees, you stare forward, you speak slow, because you know every word, every blink, every twitch of your fingers is being watched, weighed, and possibly written, and once it's inked in the ledger, it's forever. You're dismissed with a nod, but the silence that follows you out feels heavier than the words you left behind. The parchment remains in the scribe's hands, neatly folded, your name, spelled poorly perhaps, noted beside your statement. You wonder if it'll ever be read again, or if it will sit in the wooden chest behind the clerk's desk for the next decade, waiting to be reopened the moment something worse happens on your street. Back outside, the air tastes different, lighter somehow, and yet a lingering awareness clings to you. The feeling of being part of something official, something recorded. It's unsettling. You start walking home, avoiding eye contact with your neighbours. Because here's the strange twist. In a world mostly governed by memory, the few written things are taken more seriously than they deserve. A sentence spoken is forgettable. But once someone bothers to write it down, especially with wax and seal, it might as well be carved into stone. That makes the written word not just powerful, it makes it dangerous. This is why some people fear the town scribe more than they fear the constable. The constable might throw you in the stocks for a day, but the scribe? He can write a word that makes the bishop's bailiff ride to your house with shackles. And there's more. You pass the old stocks in the square. They've been empty since last week, when a tanner's apprentice was locked there for slanderous words. Not physical harm, not theft, slander. He'd said a knight's son kept bad company and might have cheated at dice. That alone, if heard by the wrong ears, meant punishment. Because medieval law wasn't only about deeds, it was about oaths, claims, and insults. Words, when spoken in the wrong tone or to the wrong person, could ruin a reputation, end a marriage, or start a blood feud. That's why many people preferred silence. A shrug was safer than an opinion. A nod could save you from having to lie. And then there's the subtle game of coded speech. You remember the butcher's wife last week saying of another merchant, "He keeps odd hours, doesn't he?" That's not gossip. That's a warning, a layered message. Everyone knows that odd hours is code for backdoor trading, or maybe worse. These half-spoken signals were everywhere, and if you didn't know how to read them, you risked looking naive or guilty. As you approach your home, you spot two neighbours leaning against a cart. They stop talking the moment they see you. One of them squints, as if trying to recall where he saw you last. Maybe he was at the court too. Maybe he heard what you said. You glance down at your hands, steady, still. In a world where most justice comes from memory and gesture, the written word is sharp, final, and almost holy. But it's the unwritten rules, the unspoken glances, the coded phrases, the trembling hands, that decide who ends up standing alone in front of a scribe next time, and you're already rehearsing what not to say. You're sitting in the corner of a smoky hall waiting your turn. It's market day, and the reeve has ordered a public measuring. You brought your grain, just like everyone else, hoping it passes without incident. The scales are simple, wooden arms, iron weights, and a leather pouch that's seen better days. But what really catches your eye is the bushel basket. It's enormous, far larger than yours, and it's not just you noticing. Every time a merchant steps forward to sell barley, the officials use their basket to measure. When a peasant steps up to pay dues, they switch to a slightly deeper one, just a finger's width taller, but enough to matter. The kind of difference you'd never complain about out loud. Because the real rule here isn't written down anywhere, it's just understood. Not all measures are equal. You remember your father grumbling about this when you were small. How some towns had long yards and short yards. How a gallon in one shire might be a quart larger than in another. Even the length of a foot, the very idea of standard distance, could vary depending on whether you were measuring cloth, timber or land, and who you were dealing with. In one nearby village there's a field still known as the King's Acre, but everyone knows it's smaller than the acre across the stream. That's because the king's officials used a measuring rod tied with a loose knot near the end, shortening every pace by just enough to cheat a dozen feet off a field. Multiply that over 10 plots, and suddenly the tacksman has reason to smile. You shift uneasily as your barley is dumped into the reeve's bushel. The weight creaks. A small stone clinks at the bottom, hidden, adding just enough heft to charge you extra. You say nothing, because in this world, complaining about a measurement implies you're questioning the authority of the man holding the scale, and that's a dangerous thing. You glance at the merchant beside you. He's brought flax, neatly bundled, and when it's his turn, the officials bring out the flatter basket. He doesn't flinch, doesn't blink, just nods politely as they underweigh it in his favour. You recognise him now. He drinks with the reeve on Wednesdays. You saw them sharing stew at the alehouse last week. You look back at your own pouch of barley, now officially light, and know your options. Pay the fine or appeal to the steward. But the steward's brother is married to the reeve's cousin. So really you have no options. It's not that you don't understand justice. You just understand custom more. And custom says, speak softly, carry a spare stone for next time, and never measure in front of a man with friends. You sling your satchel back over your shoulder, lighter now, both in grain and in dignity, and step out into the murmur of the street. Behind you, the reeve laughs at something the merchant mutters. Ahead, you pass a boy measuring out strips of leather, his father watching closely, nodding as each length is held against a rod with notches carved in. Not just inches, customary inches. They're marked in bone, darkened with ash, and you can see how the final segment is slightly narrower. That's deliberate. In medieval markets, even truth had calibration. You head toward the tannery, where hides hang like flayed flags. Here too, every sale depends on measured trust. One man swears by his hide's thickness. Another insists his came from a winter-killed ox, tougher and more valuable. But without a scale you can rely on, and without authority you dare question, most bartering comes down to reputation, and how convincingly you can say, this is the right measure. So people cheat in clever, quiet ways. Some fill the bottoms of sacks with sawdust, then cap it with flour. Others stitch coins into the hems of cloth, adding weight for a better price. A few have spoons carved to look identical, but hold different volumes, one for selling, one for buying. You learn these tricks not from books, but from watching old hands at work, their fingers moving with the calm of practiced deception. The town miller. He's famous for taking a toll, a handful of every sack ground at his mill. That's expected. But it's whispered that he's hollowed his measuring stick, leaving his half pint 3 swallows short. No one's caught him, yet everyone knows. Because in a world without digital scales or factory-stamped rulers, measurement isn't about numbers. It's about who gets to define what's fair. And if you think that's unjust, try refusing the Reeves measure next week. You pass a small shrine to St. Clement, protector of blacksmiths and sometimes merchants. People have begun leaving tokens there, scales carved in wood, tiny baskets made of straw. You pause for a breath. Not because you're pious, but because you understand the gesture. It's not worship, it's negotiation. A silent plea to something or someone bigger than the Reeves thumb on the scale. And then, a whisper from the crowd. A merchant's boy caught with a trick bucket, false bottom tied with twine. His stall's been pulled apart. His goods confiscated, not by the law, by the other merchants. Because even in a crooked system there are lines. You're allowed to bend. Everyone does. But if you're caught snapping the stick clean in two, the town will eat you alive. You keep walking, eyes on the cobblestones. You've learned something valuable today. In this world, fairness isn't a standard, it's a negotiation. And if you want to survive, you'd better carry 2 weights in your pouch, one for buying and one for selling, just like everyone else. You're watching 2 men in the square argue over bread. Not the price of it, the shape. One loaf is long and narrow, wrapped in a dusty cloth. The other is squat and round, stamped with a carved mark like a leaf. Their owners jab fingers at each other's goods, red-faced while the crowd watches with faint amusement. Eventually someone steps in and says, "Let the baker decide." And that's when you notice him, emerging from a doorway behind a wooden board, his apron streaked with flour. The town baker. He doesn't say much, just picks up each loaf, weighs them with his hands, sniffs the crust, taps the bottom. Then he nods toward the round one. That one's legal. The other, he says, is a cheat's loaf, baked heavy with barley husks or sand, shaped oddly to look larger than it weighs. The crowd nods, case closed. Because in this place, bread isn't just food, it's a statement. And every village has rules about its shape, size, and sometimes even its purpose. You might think of a loaf as just dough and heat. But in medieval times, bread revealed your rank, your wealth, and even your moral standing. If you were wealthy, you ate soft white manchet bread, baked from finely sieved wheat flour, light in colour and light on the stomach. If you were poor, you ate maslin, a rougher mix of rye and barley that turned dark and heavy, sometimes sour. And if you were a servant, well, you ate the trencher. That's right, the very plate you ate from, because round loaves were often sliced in half horizontally and topped with stew or meat. The top was eaten. The bottom, soaked and soggy, was given to servants or thrown to dogs. If you were especially unlucky, you'd get a reused trencher, one already soaked through with someone else's greasy dinner. You step back as the baker returns to his oven. The loaves inside aren't uniform, they're arranged by social order. The flat ones, for the alehouse. The long braided ones, a wedding tomorrow. And in the far corner you spot a curious loaf shaped like a crown. Ah, you've heard about those. Holy loaves! In some towns, bakers were required to bake special bread for feast days, shaped like saints, lambs, or even angels. But they weren't always symbolic. Sometimes these sacred loaves were priced higher, even if the flour inside was worse. Because people believed eating a holy-shaped loaf could bring protection, healing, even fertility. And on the flip side, there were cursed loaves too. Whispers tell of one woman who baked her loaves with poppy seeds in the shape of a twisted braid, meant to keep demons from her doorstep, or so she claimed. But when 2 children fell sick after eating one, the whole batch was burned in the square. and she left the village not long after. In this world, bread isn't just baked, it's judged. You glance down at your own small loaf, round and plain, with a crack running through the centre. It suddenly feels more complicated than it did this morning. Because in medieval times, even the shape of your bread told a story. Sometimes one you didn't mean to tell. You keep that loaf tucked under your arm as you walk, still thinking about the odd logic of it all. How something as basic as bread could spark suspicion, signal status, or summon fear. But then, in a world without ingredient lists or expiry dates, shape and crust became a kind of silent language. And that language, it could protect you or condemn you, like the assize loaf. You hear the term whispered often, mostly when the reeve passes. It refers to the official size and weight of a loaf, mandated by the assize of bread and ale, a set of laws stretching back to the 13th century. According to these rules, bakers had to sell their loaves at a consistent price, regardless of flour cost. If wheat was expensive that week, the baker simply had to shrink the loaf. Not everyone followed that rule, and that's where the baker's dozen comes in. You've probably heard the term before, 13 loaves instead of 12, but you didn't know the reason behind it. Bakers, afraid of selling underweight bread and facing fines or stocks, often added an extra loaf to every batch sold. Better to give too much than too little. 1 ounce light? That could cost you a night locked in the pillory, a soggy loaf tied around your neck as people laughed and threw vegetable peels. Some towns were stricter than others. In places where millers and bakers had close ties to guilds, inspections were regular and brutal. Officials would burst into bakeries, weigh loaves on iron scales, and even slice them open to check for fillers. Too much bran? Penalty? Sand? Worse, a hollow loaf stuffed with old crumbs? That might land you in the stocks, and no one wanted to be a baker in a bad harvest year. Because if famine struck, bread was no longer commerce. It became emotionally charged. A baker could be blamed for hunger, accused of hoarding flour or baking only for the wealthy. In some cases, desperate townsfolk stormed ovens, dragged bakers into the street, or accused them of dark dealings with millers. You pass a bakery now, the scent of hot crust curling into the air. There's a line of customers, each cradling a wooden token, a small disc used to pre-order loaves. In lean years, these tokens served as a kind of bread credit, proof of loyalty or need. Some were marked with notches, others with painted symbols. A family might guard their token like treasure. Inside, the baker slides loaves from the oven floor with a long-handled peel. You spot one with a cracked crust and an uneven rise. It's not ruined. It's humble. And that, strangely enough, might be the safest kind. Because the worst thing to bake in the Middle Ages wasn't bad bread. It was suspicious bread. Too large, and you're accused of trickery. Too small, and you're cheating. Too dark, and you're using spoiled grain. Too light, and someone might ask what you left out. So you cling to the plain, round loaf. No flourishes, no saints. Just enough crust to be honest, but not proud. And tomorrow maybe you'll ask the baker to stamp it with your own mark. A notch or scratch that says, "This loaf is mine." Not holy, not cursed, just fair. You're trying not to stare, but it's impossible. The man across from you has the longest sleeves you've ever seen. So long, in fact, that they brush the floor as he walks. They drag through the dust like trailing banners, each embroidered with pale blue thread and trimmed with tiny brass bells that chime with every sway of his arms. His hands, tucked away somewhere deep inside, invisible. He isn't alone. Another passerby struts by in a cloak with shoulders so wide it barely fits through the doorway. A woman glides past in a gown so tight from chest to waist that breathing must be optional, and just behind her, a servant scurries along, holding the end of her train like a lifeline. No one bats an eye. Because here, in this narrow alley near the town square, fashion isn't about beauty, it's about power. And the more uncomfortable it makes you, the more power you're assumed to have. You've heard the phrase before, fashion is pain. But in medieval times it was much more literal. Nobles and wealthy merchants deliberately dressed in ways that made ordinary life difficult. Tight sleeves, pointed shoes, tiny hats perched uselessly atop curled hair. Not because it looked good necessarily, but because it showed they didn't have to work. And if you couldn't work, you were better. Those long sleeves, called tippets or hanging sleeves, they weren't for warmth. They signalled wealth and rank. A person with sleeves that touched the floor clearly wasn't kneading bread or mucking out a stall. They had people for that. Sometimes the sleeves were sewn shut entirely, forcing the wearer to stick their hands out through a hidden slit. It made practical tasks nearly impossible, which again was the point. The less you could do with your hands, the higher your station seemed. And then there were the shoes. Oh, the shoes. You'd heard whispers, but seeing them up close is something else entirely. Long, narrow points jutting out from the toes like miniature skis. Some are curled back toward the shin, others stiffened with wire. Called krakows or poulaines, these shoes could stretch over 2 feet long. The longer the point, the higher your status. Of course, you couldn't run in them, or ride a horse, or walk on cobblestones without wobbling, but that was the joke. If you could afford to be helpless, you were important. Some cities even regulated shoe length by social rank. A baron might be allowed 12 inches of toe, while a lowly merchant's son had to settle for 6. Anything longer, risk a fine, or worse, public humiliation. You glance down at your own boots, plain, rounded, serviceable. Suddenly they feel almost scandalously practical. The absurdity doesn't stop there. You pass a young squire attempting to bow while wearing a doublet so padded at the shoulders it looks like he's hiding bread loaves beneath his tunic. The sleeves are slashed and stuffed, revealing glimpses of coloured silk beneath. Wasteful, but impressive. His hose are tight, bright, and, if you're honest, leave very little to the imagination. You're starting to understand the strange logic. If fashion made you ridiculous, it made you memorable. And if you were memorable, you were powerful, at least until fashion changed again. And it always did. You keep walking, boots still blessedly unpointed, and wonder what else people used to wear just to show they didn't have to walk fast, lift things, or think about the weather. Then you spot it, like a slow-moving ship of velvet. A woman draped in a gown so wide her hips stretch the entire width of the street. Underneath the fabric, hidden from view, is a frame. The farthingale, a cage-like contraption made of whalebone or willow, designed to flare the skirt into a perfect circle. She glides like a table with feet. A very wealthy table. And no, she's not headed to a feast. She's buying onions from a cart. You blink. Because while most people are scrubbing mud off their hemline, she's practically hovering above it. It's not just elegance, it's elevation. Literally. The farther your clothes are from the street filth, the farther you must be from hardship. But not all symbols were made of silk or bone. Take the humble belt, for instance. A working-class man might wear a simple leather strap, but a noble's belt could be a declaration of identity. Ornately tooled, weighted with silver or enamelled badges, and long, absurdly long, sometimes dragging behind like a tail. The end might be folded, pinned, or even kissed by admirers. And if you were a knight or squire, your belt might be the one item you're never seen without. It marked your training, your virtue, your readiness. A naked waist? That raised eyebrows. Then there's the codpiece. Yes, that codpiece. At first, it was just a triangle of fabric meant to cover the gap between 2 hose legs. Innocent enough. But as hose grew tighter and the Renaissance brought new attention to the male form, the codpiece grew bolder. Padded, shaped, and sometimes jewel-encrusted, it became a strange hybrid of armour and ego. You pass a tailor's stall, where a mannequin stands proudly with one of these creations on display, shiny, absurd, and clearly meant to impress someone. It's hard not to laugh. But then again, maybe that was part of the point. To walk around with such a thing strapped to your breeches, you had to really believe you were important. Or at least, important enough not to care what anyone else thought. And finally, there's the hair. Not yours. Hers. Because as you reach the edge of the square, you spot 2 women locked in polite conversation. One has her hair braided into a net of tiny gold threads. The other wears hers coiled beneath a towering headdress, so tall it brushes the lintel of the bakery door. This was the hennin, the famous cone-shaped hat of late medieval fashion. You've seen it in paintings, but in real life, it looks even more precarious, like a spinning top made of velvet and ambition. Some even had veils trailing from the tip, long enough to sweep the floor behind them. Of course, it wasn't practical, but no one expected it to be. That was the whole game. The harder your clothing was to wear, the more you proved you weren't bound to labour, that your hands were clean, that your time was yours, and if anyone had to hold up your sleeves, carry your train, or help you through a doorway, even better. Every inch of help whispered status. So you stand there, in your ordinary tunic, watching this parade of peacocks swirl by, and wonder just how far people will go to not look like they work for a living. The door creaks open, and a rush of warmth spills out, along with the unmistakable scent of hot wax, stale herbs, and too many bodies in a small space. You duck your head and step inside the apothecary, not to buy anything, but to watch. And oh, what a performance it is. At first glance, the place is chaos. Jars with cryptic labels, dried roots dangling like wind chimes, and bundles of moss stuffed into corners. A cat is curled on the counter. The shopkeeper doesn't shoe it. That cat probably knows more about human ailments than half the village. You find a shadowy corner and lean back against the rough wall. You're here for the spectacle, and it doesn't take long. A woman steps up to the counter, clutching a cloth-wrapped bundle like it holds her future. The apothecary, an older man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched at the end of his nose, takes it with exaggerated solemnity. He unties the knot, peers inside, and nods. For sleep, yes? She nods back. He sets to work with the confidence of a man who's been doing this since before the last plague. A pinch of dried poppy, a scrap of parchment with a symbol scrawled in ochre, a whisper over the jar, almost inaudible, then a nod, a fee, a thank you, and she's gone, and you're left blinking. Because what you just saw was a transaction not just of medicine, but of meaning, a quiet ritual dressed up as practicality. And this little shop is full of them. You take another look around. There's a bottle labelled oil of earthworm, another marked powdered mummy. Yes, that's real. For centuries, people believed ground-up mummified flesh cured everything from headaches to nosebleeds. It came at a steep price, but nothing says this better work like ingesting 2,000-year-old embalmed royalty. There's even a dried toad, suspended in wax dangling from a string above the hearth. You've heard the rumour, hang it near your chest and it draws out disease like a sponge. Whether anyone still believes that isn't clear, but it stays there. And that's the curious thing about medieval medicine. So much of it hovered between healing and theatre. Sure, some of it worked. Willow bark for pain, lavender for calm. But for every salve rooted in plant science, there were 10 more tinctures laced with meaning. Spells, charms, gestures repeated because they were familiar, not because they were proven. And in a world full of uncertainty, where real doctors were few and plague came uninvited, sometimes a ritual felt more reliable than a remedy. You wander further in, eyes catching on a green glass jar shaped like a skull. A boy near the window is being handed something wrapped in leaves. A woman behind him clutches a token carved with a crescent moon. No one looks sceptical. Why would they? This is how it's always been. Behind the counter, the apothecary catches your eye for a moment, then smiles. Barely. Maybe he knows what's in the jars and maybe he doesn't. Maybe it matters more that you think he does. Because in the end, belief might be the strongest ingredient of all. You step outside with the scent of rosemary and soot still clinging to your sleeves. The apothecary door creaks shut behind you, but the world of strange cures is far from over. Because outside the shop, out in the streets and fields and homes, everyone's a healer. Or at least, everyone pretends to be. You pass a woman sweeping her threshold, muttering under her breath. At first you think she's cursing the dust, but listen closer. It's a chant. Not quite Latin, not quite gibberish. Something passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, said to keep illness from crossing the doorway. It's a ward disguised as housework. Then there's the boy with the copper ring tied around his neck by a bit of old twine. He wears it like armour. Folks say it prevents nosebleeds. The real reason? Probably something to do with the metal reacting to skin and sweat. But it's not the science people trust. It's the ritual. If it worked once, or seemed to, that's all it takes to become truth. And let's not forget the most unexpected source of healing, the recipe books. You stop by a cottage where an older man is leafing through a thick, greasy book on his lap. It's not just for cooking. No, this is one of those strange medieval household manuals where stewed pears share pages with cures for madness and powders to ward off worms. One recipe lists the following ingredients: ashes of a burned swan feather, pounded coral, and milk of a black cow at midnight. The instructions? Vague at best. But there's something oddly comforting in how casually it's written, like boiling rice or drying apples, as if curing demonic possession is just another Tuesday chore. You head down toward the edge of the village now, where trees rise and the forest breathes. There, by a stream, a woman crouches barefoot in the shallows. She's crushing something between two stones, wild garlic and slippery elm by the smell, and humming. She's what some folks call a cunning woman. Not a midwife, not a witch. Just someone who knows which bark will soothe a fever and which flower makes a good poultice for burns. People come to her when the apothecary fails or when they don't have coin. But she charges something else. A story, a song, a bit of spun wool, payment not in gold, but in memory. Of course, not everyone trusts her. There's always suspicion when a woman works with plants and doesn't flinch at wounds. But that's part of her magic. She doesn't need a shop or a sign, just reputation. And still, even in her quiet corner of the woods, she's part of the same medieval mindset. That healing isn't just about fixing the body, but navigating the unseen forces believed to cause pain in the first place. Curses, bad air, evil eye. You don't just need salve, you need protection. That's why some people keep dried weasel hearts above their beds, or why a frog sewn into a linen pouch gets buried in the field before planting season. It's medicine and superstition braided together, and when the line between the two disappears, you realise medieval people weren't naive, they were inventive. They made meaning out of what they had, whether that was herbs, stories, or bone dust in a bottle. So as you head back toward the village, you no longer see just jars and chants and belts of garlic. You see hope, preserved in wax, etched into wood, and whispered under breath. A belief that, even in a world of danger and dirt and death, something small, a feather, a pinch of salt, a whispered name, might just work. You wake to bells. Not the tolling of a church tower or the clatter of a blacksmith's cart, but something sharper, stranger. Tiny chimes swaying from a sash of fabric as someone passes your window. You roll out of the narrow bed and press your face to the rippled glass. And there they are, mourners. A slow procession winds through the muddy lane, and every person wears black. But it's not the colour that draws your eye, it's the masks. Some are plain linen, tied with string. Others are carved from wood, painted with tear trails or solemn faces. One man wears a painted deer skull, another a mask with no eyes at all. You grab your cloak and follow. The air is thick with incense and wet leaves, and people whisper as the procession glides by, each mourner holding a small item, some with coins, others with herbs, even a dried orange stuck with cloves. Offerings, but not to the dead, to the living. Because this ritual, this strange and silent walk, isn't just about honouring the lost, it's about keeping grief contained. In the medieval world, mourning wasn't always soft or private. It had rules, customs, boundaries meant to keep sorrow from spilling out and poisoning everything. People believed grief could linger in the air, seep into soil, infect the healthy, and so they masked it, literally. Those masks you saw, they weren't decoration, they were protection. You wear a mask so the dead don't recognise you, or so that other mourners don't mistake your face for a mirror of their own loss. It's not about hiding grief, It's about ritualizing it. The procession turns toward a narrow alley lined with painted doors, and you notice one marked with black ribbon and a small sprig of rosemary. Someone's home, someone's sorrow. You watch as people step up, one at a time, and place their offering in a wooden bowl on the stoop. No knocking, no embraces, just a silent gift and a bow of the head. Inside, someone sobs, but quietly. That's important. Because wailing too loudly, crying past a certain number of days, or refusing to eat could be seen not as grief, but as inviting spirits to linger. Too much sadness, they believed, could anchor the dead, keeping them tethered to the living. So grief had its limits. You wore mourning clothes for a prescribed number of days or months, depending on who had died. You changed your behaviour, but only within bounds. Too much mourning was dangerous, too little, disrespectful. Even the flowers had rules. Rue for sorrow, yew for eternity. If you brought lilies, it better be for someone pure. If you chose wormwood, you might be accused of something darker. You step back just a little as another masked mourner passes you. This one drops a single feather into the bowl, a swan feather, curled at the tip. It reminds you of the banquet you saw weeks ago, where roasted swan was served on beds of salt. Strange how the same creature shows up in feasts and funerals. But that's the nature of medieval customs. The symbolic overlap is everywhere. A thing is never just one thing. A feather is grace, sorrow, and remembrance, all at once. And as the sun slips lower and the last mourner vanishes around the corner, you stand very still in the empty street. The bowl on the stoop now overflows with grief, disguised as tokens wrapped in silence. The door finally opens, just a sliver at first, then wider. A hand reaches out, weathered, veined, trembling slightly, and lifts the wooden bowl filled with grief offerings. Not a word is spoken. The door closes again, and the house swallows its sorrow. You linger, not because you're being impolite, but because something about this ritual feels unfinished. You've seen mourning in your own time, funerals with black suits and polished eulogies. But here, grief feels like a living thing. It has rules, it moves in patterns, and perhaps most striking of all, it is shared. Further down the street you hear the low rattle of a death cart. No dramatic cries, no tolling knell, just a slow, deliberate creak of wood. On it lies a bundle, tightly wrapped in linen, sprinkled with herbs that crackle faintly in the cold. But here's what catches your eye. The bell. Every death cart has one, hung from the front, sometimes iron, sometimes copper, depending on what the village could spare. It jingles, not to announce passage, but to ward off bad spirits. They believed that when someone died, invisible forces gathered, some curious, some malevolent. The bell's sound disrupted that. You follow as the cart rolls beyond the village, toward a low hill where the graves tilt like teeth. But there's no priest here today, no Latin chanting, just the family, a shovel, and an old woman who murmurs a rhyme as she scatters salt into the open earth. And you notice she places something else before the body's lowered. A small wooden charm, etched with a symbol you don't recognize. Not Christian. Older. It's shaped like a knot or a spiral. Something meant to confuse spirits, or perhaps to guide them. That's the surprising part. Despite the formal structures imposed by institutions, churches, coroners, kings, grief in many medieval communities still relied on local customs. Old ones, pre-Christian ones, a blend of pagan ritual and regional superstition, layered like sediment beneath the more official rites. One village might bury the dead with shoes facing east. Another might tuck bread into the folds of the shroud so the soul wouldn't arrive hungry. And some folks whispered that if you didn't bury a mirror after a death, the deceased spirit could get stuck staring back. It wasn't about belief in the modern sense. It was about balance. Death disrupted the order of things. These customs stitched it back together. One feather, one rhyme, one salt sprinkle at a time. You notice now the small pile of smooth stones beside the grave. Everyone who attends drops one after the dirt is filled, a gesture without explanation, perhaps to weigh the soul down. perhaps just to mark the moment quietly. And finally, before they leave, each mourner turns their back to the grave and walks away without looking. That's the rule. No glancing back. To look is to invite the dead to follow. As the last figure disappears into the trees, you're left alone among the tilting stones and silence. The wind picks up. It rustles the edge of your cloak and tugs your thoughts somewhere deeper. Because here's the truth that lingers, heavier than any bell. Grief in the medieval world wasn't erased. It was ritualized. It was dressed, masked, buried in layers of custom and charm, not to deny sorrow, but to tame it. And in a time when life was short and fragile and death as common as rain, that taming was everything. You wake to find a crowd gathered outside the inn, not shouting, not angry, just watching. A man stands in the centre of the square, completely still, arms raised. He wears nothing but a thin woolen shift despite the chill. Around him, onlookers shuffle, murmur, glance awkwardly at one another. You push closer, and then you see it. He's shaving his head. Not in a clean, smooth fashion. Not like a monk. No, this is something else. A strip down the centre. A jagged, uneven path of exposed scalp. The rest left wild, uncombed. And someone in the crowd whispers, "He's been humiliated." You blink. That's not what you expected. In your world, public shaming is more digital than physical. Mean comments, cruel headlines, whispers behind screens. But in the medieval world, shame was performance, and it had rules. You're witnessing the strange ritual of enforced humility, a public display meant to mark not just wrongdoing, but imbalance. Perhaps he insulted a noble, or failed to repay a debt. Maybe he spoke too boldly, or perhaps his wife wore velvet that wasn't hers to wear. But here's the twist. This wasn't always a punishment from above. Sometimes communities enforced these customs themselves. You see, status in the medieval village was a fragile thing. Too much pride, and your neighbours might just remind you you're still mortal. You recall the strange detail someone mentioned over stew last week. A baker who sold loaves too light was made to ride backward on a donkey, holding a sack of flour with holes punched through it, his own deceit leaking for all to see. Embarrassing, yes, but effective. Very. In this world, mockery is law. Take the custom of charivari, a raucous, chaotic procession of pots, pans and noise to shame someone who broke the social code. Did a widow remarry too quickly? Was a man caught being unfaithful? Did someone marry beneath themselves? Then the village would gather, bang pots, sing rude songs, parade a puppet made in your likeness, sometimes even a stuffed pig in a wedding dress. The point? To reset the balance through ridicule. You watch now as a young boy steps forward and hands the shamed man a bundle of dried nettles, stingy, itchy things. The man bows, accepts it, and rubs them along his arms. Another ritual, self-imposed discomfort, proof of contrition. And yet, you realise, this isn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This is restoration theatre, a way to fold someone back into the community without casting them out completely. They're punished, but in public, in ritual, and with the silent promise, if you bear this, you belong again. And sometimes, these rituals weren't even punishment at all. In certain cases, odd behaviours were required by custom. Did you just have your first child? You might be expected to crawl to the church door as thanks. Did you inherit your father's land? Don't forget to pretend to be whipped by the reeve before the estate changes hands. Because in this world, symbol mattered more than fact. You're not just shaving your head. You're shedding pride. You're not just crawling. You're showing gratitude. You're not just sitting backward on a donkey. You're proving you understand where you stand. You watch the man in the square lower his arms at last. His scalp is red, his eyes downcast, and the crowd, they nod. Not with scorn, but with quiet, satisfied approval. Tomorrow, he'll be welcome again. The man disappears into a side alley, leaving behind only his sheared hair scattered like straw in the dust. You linger a little longer, drawn in by the strangeness of it all. how deeply woven shame is into daily life here. Not hidden away or whispered behind curtains, but dragged out under open sky, wrapped in song and spectacle. And then you hear it, faint at first, like a hum, but it's growing louder. You turn toward the sound and realize it's not music, it's laughter, sharp, rhythmic, rising like a chant. You follow it down the winding lane until you come upon the source, a group of villagers circling a crudely dressed figure with a giant mock head made of painted leather. It's a fool wedding, a parody play staged not for joy but for discipline. A couple in the village had secretly exchanged vows without proper consent, or perhaps outside the accepted age. So now their likenesses are being performed by neighbours, exaggerated and absurd. The groom portrayed as a drooling idiot. The bride? A goat in a veil. Literally. They call it skimmington in some places. In others, it's just riding the stang. Whatever the name, the idea is the same. Expose the hidden wrong through ridiculous display. Make it so ridiculous that no one forgets. You watch as the bride stumbles over a mound of dung and the crowd erupts in cackles. A woman near you mutters, "Better to laugh them back in line than beat 'em." That's the heart of it, isn't it? These aren't merely punishments, they're community recalibrations. The line between shame and forgiveness isn't as thick as you'd think. Here, once the humiliation is endured, the slate is often wiped clean. It's rough, yes, but it beats banishment or violence. Of course, some cases aren't resolved so easily. You pass a tailor's house and notice something peculiar. A white smock nailed to the doorframe, tattered and stained. You ask a nearby child what it means. She shrugs and says, "He lied about his cloth." It's a quiet kind of shame, this one. Not loud, not theatrical, just there. A warning, a reminder, and perhaps a hope that he'll make amends. Because in this world, honour is communal property. Your reputation isn't just yours. It belongs to everyone you share bread with, trade with, pray beside. If you stain it, they all carry the mark. So they'll find ways to help you clean it, be it through bells, songs, puppets, or donkey rides. You walk back toward the centre of town as dusk begins to soften the rooftops. The shaved man is now seated by the well, accepted again, even offered a crust of bread. Someone ruffles his hairless scalp with a chuckle. It's over. He's back. And you realise, though it may look bizarre to your eyes, even cruel, this entire system of public shaming had a purpose: to avoid total ruin, to correct without destroying, to wound with performance instead of prison, to save face by letting you lose it for just one day. In a world without therapists or second chances, maybe that's the closest they had to healing. You're not sure what wakes you first. The scent of oil, the rasp of fire being coaxed back to life, or the sharp, tinny clang of a boot buckle being fastened. It's still dark out, though a band of milky light is beginning to creep under the eaves. You're in a smithy. You must have wandered in last night, lulled to sleep by the quiet hiss of dying coals. Now, though, everything is movement. A woman, shoulders broad from years of hammerwork, fastens her apron with a jerk. Her son, no older than 10, is already turning the bellows with practised rhythm. Neither of them speaks, and yet the air feels thick with anticipation. You glance down, and then you see them. A row of gleaming spurs, freshly polished, laid out like relics. Nearby, padded leather gloves, an iron bit, and a long red sash. Not tools of war, not even tools of travel. These are symbols. Someone's being knighted today. And the smith is preparing more than armour. She's preparing a costume. Because knighthood, as you're learning, is as much theatre as it is duty. You slip outside, following the faint echo of drums down the lane. It's not far to the manor. There, in the dewy grass, a young man stands motionless, eyes fixed ahead. He's barefoot, wearing only a thin white tunic, and his face is drawn, almost frightened. Today is his vigil. He's been fasting. He spent last night in the chapel, alone, kneeling with his sword laid across the altar. Not speaking, not moving. He's supposed to contemplate death, honour, and his own unworthiness. You'd expect grandeur, but what you find is ritualised humility. The knight in waiting is meant to feel small before he's raised up. Before he earns his spurs, he must feel the weight of not deserving them. But even this pageantry is strategic. Knighthood wasn't always solemn. Back in the 11th century, many knights were little more than warlords on horses. The church and monarchy, struggling to control them, rebranded the role, injecting it with symbolism, chivalry, and elaborate oaths. Hence the new customs. One white tunic to represent purity. One sleepless night for reflection. A ceremonial bath the morning of for cleansing not just dirt but pride. And then the blow. You've heard about it, called the accolade. A flat-handed strike across the neck or cheek, just before the sword is placed on the shoulder. It seems violent, but it's symbolic. The blow represents the last time the knight may be struck without retaliating, a test of patience, of honour, and if you're honest, of performance. Because knighthood is a stage. The squires fussing with buckles, the priest murmuring Latin, the lord placing the sword, all are part of the script. And yet it's more than a show. These customs create belief. In the knight, in the crowd, even in you. You step back as the boy from the forge arrives with the spurs glinting in the light. He bows, presents them. The knight in waiting nods, and slowly, deliberately, kneels. The crowd hushes. The pageantry is beginning. A hush settles across the courtyard like a velvet curtain. The only sound now is the quiet shuffle of boots on damp grass, and the soft creak of leather as the squire tightens the straps on the knight's arm. You watch as the young man, eyes downcast, extends his hand to receive the sword. Not to wield it, yet, but to offer it. A priest steps forward, takes the weapon, and places it on the altar once more. There's incense now, faint but sweet, swirling through the morning chill. It clings to your hair, your clothes, even your tongue. Then comes the oath. The knight kneels once again, reciting words that sound ancient, yet perfectly rehearsed. To defend the weak, to be loyal to his lord, to uphold justice, to serve with honour, even if that means death. But you notice something odd. A man nearby, dressed not in armour but in velvet, mutters something about wool prices and land disputes. You edge closer. Apparently this entire ceremony, this crowning moment of glory, is being timed between meetings about grazing rights and grain storage. And that's when you understand. This isn't just about honour, it's also about property. Knighthood, for all its nobility, was deeply tied to economics. The sword was a symbol, yes, but the land was the prize. Being knighted meant gaining access to fiefs, revenue, prestige. In many cases, a young man couldn't be considered for marriage or inheritance until this rite was complete. And for ambitious families? The ceremony was a performance not just for God and king, but for future fathers-in-law. It was medieval branding, the bath of purity, often scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary to impress noble guests. The white tunic, sometimes custom embroidered with family sigils. Even the vigil wasn't always solitary. Some families arranged it with visiting nobles watching silently, a not-so-subtle display of piety. Still, despite the pomp, you can't help but be moved. The young man rises. The lord approaches, holding the sword now with both hands. The blade rests gently on one shoulder, then the other, and then, with a swift movement, the lord strikes him across the cheek. The sound cracks in the morning air. The knight flinches, but he holds firm. No retaliation, no expression. He is knighted. A quiet applause follows, not clapping but nods, murmurs, hands to hearts. The boy from the forge stands taller. Even the velvet-clad landowners offer a respectful bow. And in that moment, you see how all the customs, the beth, the sash, the oath, even the slap come together. Not just as spectacle, but as a carefully constructed transformation. A boy leaves the chapel. A knight emerges. As the sun pushes over the rooftops, he mounts his horse. His armour is still simple. His sword is unmarked. He hasn't fought a single battle, but none of that matters right now, because every eye watches him, believing. And sometimes, belief is what makes the man. You wander into the village just as the midday bell rings, though it's not a bell you hear, but a hollow thunk echoing off the walls. You glance around, confused. The source is a great wooden board hung from a crossbeam at the centre of the square with a heavy mallet beside it. A man takes another swing and the thunk repeats. It's not for show, it's the tithing drum, summoning everyone to the meeting. Curious, you edge closer. There's tension in the air. Women with aprons still dusted in flour, men smelling of horse sweat and barley. Even the reeve, the local steward, looks pinched around the mouth. At the centre stands a figure in a patched green cloak, holding a bundle of papers. He's not a priest, nor a lord. He's the ale conner come to inspect the village beer. That's right, beer. And everyone's anxious, because ale isn't just refreshment. It's currency, nourishment, and local pride all in one foamy mug. And every batch brewed by a housewife or alewife is subject to inspection. Too weak, and it's fraud. Too strong, and it's sin. Too bitter, and it's gossip. Too sour, and it's war. You follow the crowd to the small hut by the stream, where a tall woman in her 40s, Ida, is waiting. She's known for her rhubarb-tinged brew. You watch as the ale conner dips a wooden ladle, sips, and nods. Ida doesn't smile, but you can see the tension ease in her shoulders. She's passed. But there's more. He pulls out a soft leather pouch, empties a few coins onto the bench. A ledger is opened, lines are drawn. Because this isn't just about taste, it's about tax. You lean closer and spot a faint wax-sealed token on the bench, round, stamped with a wheat sheaf. It's the ale token, proving that Ida's batch can now be legally sold. Without it, she'd risk punishment, or worse, public shame. And now the second inspection begins. Not of ale this time, but of bread. A different woman steps forward, carrying 2 loaves. One is round and pale, the other darker and flat. A clerk marks something in his book. This isn't random. In medieval villages, bread was regulated with almost religious fervour. The assize of bread and ale, first codified in the 13th century, dictated prices, weights, and ingredients based on grain costs. Bakers who cheated by using filler like ground beans, chalk, or even sawdust could be tied to a cart and paraded through town with their bad loaves hung around their necks. And here's the oddest part. You see a small loaf placed on a separate shelf, not for sale. It's slightly overbaked, crusty. That's the sample loaf, the pain de jugement. Every baker had to give one from each batch to the local official, just in case someone got sick and they needed to trace the source. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was evidence. Suddenly the customs start making sense. What looks like micromanagement, the tapping of casks, weighing of dough, sniffing of barley, is really about trust. These people rely on each other to survive the winter. One spoiled batch could mean weeks of illness or worse. And so, these rituals grew. Not as superstitions, but as systems. Primitive, yes, but effective. The market square begins to hum again, though something about it now feels different. You no longer see just stalls and clumsy hand-painted signs. You see a living network of customs that, to the outsider, might look quaint or ridiculous, but to those who live by them, are the very scaffolding of survival. You wander past the alewife's hut and catch a glimpse of a small wooden plaque on her door, a faded red symbol carved in wax and nailed above the lintel. You pause, curious. That's the official ale stake, a kind of medieval billboard. If it's hanging out front, it means ale is fresh and available for sale. If it's taken down, she's either sold out or been barred from selling. In some towns, a tuft of greenery or a birch branch served the same role, an organic, swaying, open sign. You smirk. So much for modern marketing, but just beyond that, another ritual plays out, this one quieter. At the edge of the market, a man kneels beside a large stone slab, chiselling something into its surface. A boy reads aloud from a list. The names are familiar, Ida's among them. You've stumbled upon the bread and ale ledger, a public record carved into stone or wood, updated weekly. Who passed inspection, who didn't, who paid the fine, who refused. There's no shouting, no stocks, no dunking stool today. Just names, etched for everyone to see. Public shame and public praise preserved side by side. It's not just the vendors being watched. Buyers have their own rituals too. You spot a woman holding a small sack of flour up to the light, letting it sift between her fingers. Another sniffs a wedge of cheese. A man taps a dried fish against his boot to check for rot. Every gesture you once thought peculiar now feels precise, learned, repeated. And then someone drops a silver coin into a wooden bowl, and all eyes snap toward the sound. It's the start of the poor's loaf collection. Each day, a portion of unsold but clean bread is collected, tallied, and redistributed. The token in the bowl? A subtle promise from the baker to add 2 loaves to the pile tomorrow. You notice the same symbol on the bowl as the one outside Ida's hut. A mark not of the church, but of the local food guild, one of many lay organisations that maintain these customs long before any official decree. Now, just as you begin to think it's all about control, a cart rolls into view, not an ordinary one. This is a measuring cart, painted bright red, adorned with bells. Children chase behind it. It's here for the quarter-day audit. Yes, every few months local officials would weigh standard loaves, sample random barrels, and even measure market stalls to make sure no one had crept a few inches further into public space than permitted. A butcher with too much bench space could block his rival's access to foot traffic. You shake your head. Bread, ale, and butcher benches. Who would have thought medieval daily life was a maze of metrics? But this wasn't red tape for the sake of it. This was protection. Against greed. Against sickness. Against famine. You catch Ida's eye as she returns with a tray of mugs. She winks. Her ale has passed inspection. Her name is on the ledger. Her token hangs proudly above her door, and tonight, when the village gathers by firelight, it'll be her brew they raise in toasts, and no one will question it. Because they saw it tested, tasted, counted, watched. Not magic, not myth, just the slow, careful art of trust, poured, weighed, and baked into every part of life. You walk along the muddy path that runs between the cottages and the edge of the common field, your boots sinking just a little more than you'd like. The air smells of turned earth and damp wool. A group of villagers are standing in a wide circle near a line of fence posts. They're not gossiping or haggling or calling out for help. They're watching 2 men argue over a fence. Well, not a fence exactly, a post. A single wooden stake, barely 2 feet high. One man says it marks the edge of his bean plot. The other says it's half a foot too far west and cutting into the shared pasture. You'd think it was nothing, just a post. But everyone here knows this isn't just about property. It's about boundaries, both physical and social. In the medieval world, when maps were rare and deeds were vague or non-existent, the placement of one stake could unravel a dozen other agreements. And when a village ran on shared memory more than paper records, that post was sacred. Suddenly the group shifts as a third figure arrives, an older woman with a thick braid wrapped like a crown atop her head. She carries no tools, no badge, no scroll, just a long staff and a face that's seen 20 winters more than the rest. This is the perambulator, or more locally the walker, she remembers. Every spring the villagers walk the bounds of the parish, the beating of the bounds they call it. And she's the living map. She knows where the crooked elm once stood, before it fell in the storm. She knows the patch where the old quarry pit was filled in with stones. She remembers where a boy once slipped on a frozen ditch and broke his arm. That ditch, now overgrown, marks the west edge of the lane. She places her staff firmly beside the disputed post. That's wrong, she says plainly. You moved it last frost. No one questions her. In a world without GPS, boundary stones weren't just markers. They were stories. Oral chains passed down through these beaters, generations who remembered, not because it was quaint, but because it was survival. You recall something you saw earlier tucked into the eaves of a barn, a split twig tied with red twine hanging above the door. You thought it was a charm. Maybe it was, but more likely it was a boundary token, a signal to neighbours that the hay stacked behind that wall was off limits. These weren't laws enforced by lords. These were customs, policed by memory, by ceremony, and sometimes by public embarrassment. During the perambulations, it wasn't unusual for boys to be whipped or bumped against key landmarks. Not as punishment, but as a learning tool. The bruises would fade, but the memory of where they happened wouldn't. The border runs from the hawthorn past the pig trough to the stone shaped like a stoat, remember? That's where Will got a smack last year. Crude, but effective. You glance back at the post. No one's arguing anymore. Instead, the villagers are already moving on. The dispute was settled not by authority, but by shared recollection. A collective archive stored in heads and hearts, not shelves. And as strange as it seems, it worked. As the crowd disperses, you follow the older woman, still holding her walking staff, still steady as an oak. She hums softly as she steps over a stone wall, then pauses to rest near a thatched bench. Two children approach with dried apples. One hands her a piece, the other simply says, "Tell us about the bog rock." She smiles and begins. That bog rock, now half sunk and mossy, once marked the boundary between grazing rights. But before that, it was where her grandmother hid 2 iron pots during the raid in the year of the fire. And before that, it was where the cattle would always lie on frosty mornings. That's how it was passed down, not in ledgers, but in layers of lived-in memory. Boundaries weren't just coordinates. They were anchored to people, events, and everyday drama. You sit nearby and watch as more stories drift out, not just hers. Other elders join in, adding layers to the landmarks. That hollow tree where the miller's son got caught cheating weights. That stream bend where a wedding procession once drowned a pig. It hits you. This is a form of folk cartography, and it's surprisingly robust. Land rights in many parts of medieval Europe were recorded this way. Oral testimonies witnessed by entire communities, reinforced by ritual walks and shared moments. The fences may crumble, but the stories hold firm. Further down the path you pass a row of pebbles embedded into a low wall in a peculiar pattern. 7 white stones, 3 red. You learn it's a secret code of sorts, a signal agreed upon by neighbours to identify land inheritance lines. Not official, not even entirely legal, but understood. If someone removed one of those stones, the entire village would know. You think of the absurdity of it. Centuries of human effort, all to avoid one neighbour stacking hay 2 feet into another man's beans. And yet, somehow, it worked. Even the most mundane customs, like planting a whitethorn bush at a field's edge, could carry immense meaning. Whitethorn wasn't chosen at random. It was hardy, long-living, and tangled enough to resist casual trimming. But it also had an almost mythical status, feared for its thorns, respected for its stubbornness. Once planted, it was a statement. This here is mine. Cross it at your peril. You chuckle. Even plants were enlisted in the art of subtle negotiation. Not far from the last thorn bush stands an open field with ridge and furrow lines still visible beneath the grass. They look like soft waves in the earth, long narrow humps curving ever so slightly. Each ridge was once a strip of someone's land, assigned through the open field system. You might own the 3rd ridge, the 6th, and the 9th. Your neighbour might have the others. But here's the catch. No one owned a whole square. The strips were scattered, intentionally, to balance out the good and bad soil, to prevent greed, and to ensure cooperation. If your cow broke a fence, you'd know whose grain it trampled, because you'd likely be standing in your own strip not far away. That chaos? It was organised. The woman with the braid rises again and taps the ground with her staff. This ridge was my mother's, she says. She grew barley here. It always bent west, even when the wind blew still. You smile. In a world without rulers, grids, or satellites, people use stories, stones, scars, songs. Even the direction barley leaned to draw lines and settle lives. You wander deeper into the village and find yourself pulled toward the sound of clanging iron. At first you think it must be the smith. Another horseshoe, another ploughshare. But no, the noise is lighter, sharper. You round the corner of a low shed and see a row of villagers standing in line, not at a stall or market, but in front of a wooden beam nailed between two posts. A scale hangs there, and beside it, a woman sits with a small ledger and a sharp eye. She's not selling anything. She's watching. You've stumbled into one of the village's quietest but most sacred customs, the measuring of goods, not by law, not by royal decree, but by communal agreement, an early form of consumer protection that could shame or elevate a tradesman in equal measure. At her side is a small wooden cylinder, short, squat, with a flat lid and a faded ribbon around the top. This, you learn, is a standard pint, the village's very own. In a world where units varied wildly between towns, and where a pound of grain in one market might be a third lighter than in another, villages often established their own measurements. Local elders would agree on a volume or weight, usually by marking out a vessel and sealing it with wax or twine. This pint, it was the law here, and if your ale or barley came short of that measure, the entire village would know. But here's where things get strange, because that pint isn't the same size as the one used in the town 5 miles over, and that was completely normal. Units weren't standardised until much later. In fact, there were over 60 recognised types of gallons in medieval England alone, some for ale, some for wine, some for grain, some bigger, some suspiciously smaller. So you can imagine what that did to trade. Villagers weren't stupid. They built protections into their customs. The pint, once set, would be stored in a public place, often the church porch, or in this case, the ledger woman's home. Anyone could demand a recheck. You watch as a merchant nervously pours beans into the measuring cylinder. It spills a bit. The woman frowns. A murmur rises. That's twice this month he's come up short. He may not get banned, but people will remember. And memory, in this village, is everything. You think of the assize of bread, a royal law from centuries ago that tied the price of bread to the cost of grain. Bakers had to adjust the size of their loaves to match, but in practice it was enforced not by knights, but by the village ale conner or bread weigher, ordinary folks who checked for fairness, and if a loaf was light, that baker might be forced to wear it around his neck in the square. Public shame was a powerful deterrent. Just then, the woman pulls out a second, smaller cup. This one is deeper, narrow, with iron bands. It's used for measuring salt, you're told. Salt was rare, expensive, and sometimes taxed. So naturally it had its own custom unit, often secret, known only within the parish. You see now that all this wasn't just about grain or ale. It was about trust, and that trust was measured, tested, and performed in public, because in a time before receipts and barcodes, everyone was the ledger. The more time you spend around that wooden scale, the more you realise how deeply people cared, not just about what was measured, but how. Fairness wasn't some abstract virtue. It was baked into every barley count, every swill of ale, every pinch of spice passed between hands, and if something seemed off, the village remembered, that merchant with the short beans? His name wouldn't go into any official record, but it would live on in murmurs, at the well, in the alehouse, during the winter spinning circles. Reputation, here, was a currency more volatile than silver. You step away from the weighing post and wander into the covered market stalls, little more than wood awnings patched with straw, some leaning sideways from last season's storm. There's no one selling apples. Instead, you see a curious exchange. A man in a patched green tunic offers a bundle of rushes to a woman carrying a goose. No coins, just a nod. Then he's gone. This is barter in its rawest form. But there's more at play than meets the eye. Many medieval villages operated within what we'd now call token economies. Small lead or wooden tokens, usually stamped with a mark known to the locals, stood in for coin. Not counterfeit, not illegal, just local currency. A baker might issue tokens redeemable only at his oven. A brewer might offer tokens for a future pitcher of ale. And sometimes, those tokens became more trustworthy than actual coin. especially when royal mints debased silver or when war made actual pennies scarce. After all, the king didn't feed your ox, the brewer did. You sit for a while near the edge of the market and watch a boy hand a token, flat, palm-sized, with a bird scratched into it, to an older man. The man smiles, disappears behind a curtain and returns with a pot of warm broth. That's the evening meal sorted. The boy lingers, then does something strange. He walks across the square, stops at a smooth stone slab, and places another token, this one larger, duller, into a crack in the stone. Then he walks away. You ask a nearby woman what just happened. She explains that it's part of the red page system, an old local ritual, half legend, half ledger. Those large tokens aren't for food. They're for recording favours. Helped someone mend a cart, left an extra blanket during frost. You slip a token into the stone. Later, when you need help, someone else takes it and comes to repay the kindness. The stories of who owes what aren't written down. They're remembered by the elders, passed along in whispers and firelight. In this village, debt isn't just economic, it's social, and the rules aren't enforced by courts or scribes, but by custom, gossip, and quiet expectation. You start to realise, even without a central authority, this chaotic market holds together. There are rules, but they're not written. Measurements, but not standard. Money, but not minted. And yet, it all works. You watch a woman leave the stall with a sack of dried herbs, holding her token tight. A breeze stirs the red cloth tied to the token slab. Its only sign to outsiders that this rock means anything. But to the villagers, it holds 1,000 unspoken promises. You wander down a rutted path behind the village green, where the breeze carries the scent of smoke and damp wool. It leads you to a cluster of narrow sheds, all leaning at odd angles like they've been whispering secrets to one another. A low hum of voices reaches your ears. Women, mostly, bent over benches, their fingers busy with cloth, herbs and thread. At first, you think this is a weaver's hut or a herb blending shed. But no. The work here isn't commercial. It's symbolic. A young girl carefully pierces a dried sprig of rosemary with a tiny bone needle, tying it with coarse blue thread into a scrap of linen. Next to her, an older woman folds a piece of parchment and sews it into the hem of a wool tunic. It's not decoration, it's protection. You've just stumbled into one of the lesser-known but widely practiced customs of the Middle Ages, sewing secrets into clothing. In an age when sickness came without warning, when misfortune followed birth and drought alike, when the world felt largely out of your control, people turned to small everyday talismans. Nothing grand, nothing royal, just little acts of warding, stitched quietly into the seams of life. You sit beside the fire pit and watch a woman carefully press 3 dried beans into a pouch, wrap it in a strip of lamb's wool, and tuck it into the lining of a cloak's shoulder. She doesn't explain. She doesn't need to. Each object carries meaning, known only to the person who sewed it or the family who passed it on. Beans for fertility, red thread to ward off illness, blue thread for safe travels, hair, sometimes your own, sometimes your mother's, woven into cuffs or collars to keep memory close. One of the women leans in to show you an older item, a glove, long worn through at the fingers, but with a scrap of vellum sewn into the wrist. Faded ink spells out a word in Latin, but no one here reads Latin. The word's presence is what matters, because somewhere, someone told them that writing, especially holy or foreign, carried power. Whether or not they understood the word, they believed in its weight, and belief, in this world, has its own gravity. Not all the stitches are hopeful, though. You see a darker bundle, bits of charcoal, ash, and nail clippings sewn tightly into a man's jerkin. It's heavy, meant not to ward off misfortune, but to absorb it, like a sponge tucked close to the body, and if the man fell ill, the bundle would be removed and buried at the crossroads. You're told that crossroads confuse spirits. You nod. It makes as much sense as anything else today. You start to see it everywhere, the subtle bulge beneath a hatband, the small lump tucked into a baby's sleeve, even a shoelace dyed ochre. Just one. when the other is plain. These aren't accidents, they're messages to the world, to fate, to whatever forces lie beyond. And though they don't shout, they endure, in cloth and thread and the hush between stitches. You follow the stitching trail out of the sewing shed and back into the winding village paths. But something's shifted. Now that you've seen the hidden messages sewn into seams, you start noticing signs of symbolism everywhere. A clay pot left upside down on a windowsill, a feather tucked above a doorway, 3 small stones stacked beside a cowshed. Each detail seems ordinary, until you realise it's not. You've entered the world of coded domestic customs, where everyday gestures weren't just practical, but deeply symbolic. In a place where most couldn't read or write, the language of signs filled the silence. You stop to watch a woman hanging laundry. The way she knots the sheets at the corners catches your eye. It isn't to keep them from blowing away, at least not entirely. She tells you it's to hold the peace in the house. A quiet ritual, one her grandmother taught her, who learned it from someone else long gone. No one questions it, they just do it. The idea that objects absorb intention isn't a quirk, it's a framework. A spoon placed facing down wards off bad luck. A broom left bristles up keeps quarrels from entering. A bowl of water left under the bed during childbirth is said to catch the pain. No parchment spells, just habits made holy by repetition. Even movement could be a kind of spell. Take the practice of sweeping out the hearth widdershins counterclockwise on certain nights of the year. It was said to clear away lingering anger, not in a grand poetic sense, but literally as if sweeping the bad moods into the dirt. As you pass another doorway, you see a child's footprint pressed into a mud brick step, circled with chalk. Not accidental. That's a ward against wandering illnesses, you're told. The child's print keeps the sickness close to the ground, too low to enter the lungs. There's no herbalist here. But the mother watches her child like a hawk, and that footprint is her medicine. And when someone dies, because yes, of course, death visits often, the customs multiply. Mirrors covered with cloth to prevent the soul from being trapped. Windows cracked open just a sliver so the spirit can leave. A handful of salt thrown into the fire at midnight to close the gate. Each act done not out of superstition but tradition. You find yourself pausing near a windowsill where 3 wilted flowers rest in a cup of ash. There's no label, no explanation, but somehow you understand. This is a kind of grief you're not meant to fix, just witness. You realise the seams of this society weren't stitched with laws, but with quiet, persistent meaning. Not shouted from pulpits or carved into stone, but passed from hand to hand in gestures, in thread, in the way a spoon is laid beside a bowl. It's easy to laugh at it from the distance of centuries, but when the world offered little control, these rituals weren't foolish. They were anchors, and maybe, in their own quiet way, they still are. The wooden lane slopes downward now, and you follow it toward the edge of the village, where the houses thin out and the sounds of life give way to a slower rhythm. You're drawn by the smell of fresh earth and the low clinking of tools. You find yourself standing before a long trench, its sides neatly squared. 2 men are digging silently, sweat darkening their linen tunics. But this isn't a grave, it's a latrine trench, and it turns out you're about to discover one of the most revealing customs of all. Not the trench itself, no, but what people did with what came out of it. Because in the Middle Ages, human waste wasn't just waste, it had potential. You watch a man carry a heavy wooden pail toward a patch of walled garden. He moves carefully, not from disgust, but from respect. What he's carrying is valuable. It's known as night soil, a polite way of saying it's human excrement collected overnight, and it's the foundation of next season's cabbage. In many villages, human waste was regularly collected and used as fertilizer, often mixed with animal dung and straw. And it wasn't just in the countryside. Even city dwellers had arrangements, unofficial of course, where gong farmers would empty cesspits and sell the contents to nearby farmers. The job of a gong farmer, horrific by today's standards. You'd descend into pits of filth, often at night, hauling bucket after bucket of reeking sludge. But oddly, they were well paid, partly because no one else wanted the job, and partly because, well, poop was profitable. Still, this wasn't a free-for-all. Where and how you dumped your waste mattered. You see a young boy scolded for tipping a chamber pot too close to the well. There were rules, some unwritten, some enforced harshly, about keeping drinking water and brown water far apart. Break that, and your whole family might fall sick by sunrise. But the real surprise comes when an elderly woman shows you a bucket painted black. Not just any chamber pot. This one's for punishment. If a man had humiliated his neighbour, say by cheating him in a market deal or publicly insulting his wife, he might find himself at the receiving end of a rough justice ritual. The village women would collect human waste in the black pot, carry it through the streets, and dump it in front of the offender's door. A gesture of deep disgrace. And sometimes, though whispered, never shouted, it was thrown. You think of insults today. Tweets, maybe, or passive-aggressive notes. Now picture being pelted with a ladle of warm human waste by a woman with calloused hands and no patience for dishonour. There's no pretending you're innocent after that. The latrine, it turns out, wasn't just a place of disposal. It was a stage, a system, a source of fuel, food, and when needed, fury. You start to understand how even the most disgusting customs carried deeper meaning. How survival, shame, and soil were tangled together in ways modern life has long forgotten. And you wonder, quietly, what you might be doing now that someone 500 years from now would find just as strange. The farther you walk, the more you realise medieval sanitation was never just about cleanliness. It was a language, one that spoke volumes about class, power, and the delicate dance of public and private shame. You step into a cramped alley between two cottages and stumble upon a low wooden door. Behind it, a privy shared by 3 families. No lock, just a worn stone slab with 2 keyhole-shaped openings, one large, one small. Father and daughter, grandmother and grandchild. Whoever needed to go, went. No questions. But it's not just the sharing that surprises you. It's the decor. A small bunch of dried lavender dangles from a hook. A carving of a fox is etched into the beam. These weren't there to impress guests. They were tokens, maybe superstitions, or maybe just something to soften the grimness of the place. You spot a rough-hewn box beside the seat, filled with what looks like moss. Not cloth, not paper. Moss. Absorbent, abundant, and soft enough, at least when it's dry. In winter, you don't ask. And then there's the riddle of where it all went. Some latrines emptied into cesspits, others drained directly into streams. Yes, even ones used downstream for washing. In larger towns, you'd find garderobes, those curious toilet rooms built right into the castle walls, with a vertical shaft that dropped everything down to the moat, which meant, if you're ever tempted by the romantic idea of swimming in a castle moat, you might want to rethink that. But waste wasn't always hidden away. In fact, it could be made loud and public, especially when someone broke the unspoken rules of modesty. Take the tradition of Skimmington rides, a kind of communal humiliation parade. Let's say a husband was found to be henpecked by his wife, or a woman was accused of cheating. Neighbours would bang pots, beat drums, and parade an effigy of the guilty party, sometimes seated on a mock toilet. Yes, really. A full performance, complete with lewd gestures and latrine noises. What started as a private failing would be dragged, symbolically and sometimes literally, through the filth for all to see. You find yourself back at the edge of the village, watching a young girl emptying a chamber pot into a compost pile. She wipes her hands on her apron, shrugs, and goes back to feeding chickens. No disgust, just rhythm, a task among many. And suddenly it clicks. The Middle Ages didn't hide its mess. It managed it, transformed it, and, even more strangely, ritualized it. Waste wasn't just flushed and forgotten. It lingered, like memory, like consequence. You glance down at your own modern shoes, impossibly clean. You think about your sealed bathroom, your scented soaps. Then you remember the woman with the black chamber pot, the boy sweeping moss off the seat, the laughter of children skipping around a compost heap as if it were a bonfire, and you start to see the privy for what it really was, not a source of shame, but a mirror, reflecting how people lived, what they feared, and how they fought to keep control in a world where very little was truly private. You step away with a strange sense of reverence, eyes open, nose wary, but heart a little humbled. You leave behind the privy and its quiet truths, stepping into the open air just as a faint breeze stirs the village green. Children scatter past you, barefoot and wild-eyed, chasing something invisible. But your eye catches something more curious, something hanging on a rope outside a cottage window. It's a shirt, but not just any shirt. This one has bright red stitching along the neckline, a series of tiny knots along the sleeves, and a faint symbol embroidered right above the heart. 3 lines, stacked like a ladder. And just like that, you've stumbled into the realm of medieval clothing codes, where fashion wasn't just about function or flair. It was a language, a secret one. At first glance, you'd think people just wore what they had, and for the poor, that wasn't much. But in truth, even peasants knew that what they wore spoke volumes. Colour, trim, hemline, even the way your belt hung. It all meant something. The shirt drying in the sun, for instance, belongs to a widow. The triple lines, a quiet signal. She's not in mourning anymore, but she's not remarried either. It's a kind of social pause button, a reminder to others that her status is shifting, that she's somewhere between grief and availability. You follow another villager down a lane and notice her skirt is tucked up on one side. Not from haste, but intention. In this village, that little tuck says she's a wet nurse, available for hire, experienced and currently unbound to any household. These weren't rules made by kings. They were made by everyone else. An entire vocabulary of stitches and styles, whispered across wool and linen, known by those who lived and worked with it daily. You see a young boy clutching a cap that's too large for his head. It's green, a colour often reserved for servants or apprentices, and clearly handed down. But the inside brim has a patch of grey fur stitched crudely in. That, you learn, is his mother's doing. She added it in hopes that someone from the manor might notice, take pity, maybe offer him a place indoors for winter. Sometimes fashion wasn't just about status. It was a message, a gamble, a quiet plea sewn in thread. And yet, some messages were more dangerous. Across the square, a merchant's daughter walks briskly, her sleeves puffed and slashed, revealing layers beneath, bright, expensive fabric peeking out. It's eye-catching, daring, even a bit scandalous, and in some places, illegal. Because during much of the medieval period, towns enforced sumptuary laws, strict rules about who could wear what. Velvet, reserved for nobility, gold embroidery, off-limits unless your family had a title, and heaven help you if you wore ermine fur without the right bloodline. Breaking those rules wasn't just fashion faux pas, it was social defiance, a declaration that you didn't accept your place, that you wanted to be seen differently. You think about your own clothes, labels, trends, logos. Do they say who you are, or who you want people to think you are? In the Middle Ages there was no guessing. Your body was a billboard, and every stitch came with strings. The longer you linger among the drying linens and swishing hems of this medieval village, the more you realise that clothing wasn't merely sewn, it was negotiated, with rules, with luck, and sometimes with fear. You pass a stone bench where 2 older women sit spinning wool, their fingers moving like clockwork. One wears a simple coif, but the other has a long pointed hood with a trailing lyre pipe that touches the ground behind her. That tail isn't just for flair, it's meant to show age, wisdom and community status. Not nobility, mind you, but respect. The kind earned slowly, spun year by year, thread by thread. The younger villagers give her space when she walks by, not because they fear her, but because they know what her clothing says. It's the same reason no one sits in her place at the market. But as always, some try to twist the language. A boy, no more than 15, stands in the square in a cloak too fine for his station. It's borrowed, stolen more likely from a distant cousin who works in a merchant household. His boots are polished with pig fat to make them shine, his cap pulled low. He wants to pass for someone he's not, perhaps to court a girl, or get served faster at the alehouse. And for a moment he almost succeeds, until an elder woman spits beside him and mutters something sharp. You catch the word cloth tongue, a slur you learn for someone who lies with their wardrobe. It wasn't always words that punished this deception. In some towns, if you were caught wearing forbidden fabric, you could be publicly shamed, your clothing confiscated or cut on the spot. Tailors were required to report customers who requested styles above their rank. Some were even fined for selling ambitious sleeves. And then there were the hidden messages. You find yourself in a small side alley, staring at a curious display. A line of white aprons hung carefully on a fence. At first they seem identical, but then you notice one has 3 tiny blue crosses stitched along the hem. Another has a single red circle. You ask, and a passing washerwoman smiles. They're signals for the matchmaker, she explains. Each stitch pattern corresponds to a family situation. One might say, girl ready for marriage, dowry modest, good health. Another might signal, boy of age, father willing to negotiate. No meetings, no letters, just laundry, fluttering in code. Even hair could send messages. A woman with her hair fully covered was married. One with a braid over one shoulder was courting. 2 braids? A widow open to remarriage. The customs changed by region, but the idea remained. You didn't need to speak to make your status known, and sometimes silence was safer, because if you wore the wrong thing, asked the wrong tailor, or stitched the wrong message, you might be accused of more than vanity. You might be accused of ambition. And in a society where place was everything, ambition was a kind of heresy. You step back out of the alley, the sky softening to rose above the chimneys. The breeze catches a sleeve here, a hood there, turning the whole street into a pageant of unspoken words, clothing as conversation, as strategy, as survival. And suddenly you realise you've been reading the village all along. You just didn't know the language yet. A sharp wind cuts down the lane as you cross into the outskirts of the village, where fewer houses cluster and the air carries the smell of peat smoke and turned earth. You pass a man stacking bundles of twigs into a tidy pile, each tied with coarse rope. At first it looks like firewood, but then you notice the odd shape, the careful arrangement, the way some bundles form a crude lattice. He's building a fence, but not just any fence. It's a boundary of woven branches that spirals inward like a maze around his tiny garden. At the very centre, a patch of nettles grows wild, unpicked, untamed. You're staring at a remnant of a forgotten ritual, one of many medieval customs that look like superstition but work like science, if you know how to read them. In the Middle Ages, boundaries mattered, and not just for property. Fences weren't only for keeping animals in or thieves out. They were symbolic, protective, sometimes even sacred. You pass a small barn where bundles of rowan branches are tied above the doorway, one on the left, one on the right, and a crooked nail in between. No one says why, but everyone knows you don't build a stable without it. And if you move into a new house, you walk the perimeter 3 times on the first night, scattering ash and salt. A habit so ingrained it's barely noticed anymore. At the edge of a narrow field, a boy hammers a coin into the base of a tree. The bark is scarred from dozens before him. You ask what he's doing. He shrugs and says, "For luck." But his mother chimes in, to mark that he was here. Suddenly you realise that this isn't about property or trespass. It's about presence, proof, memory. In a world where most people owned nothing, no land, no written record, not even a full name, these invisible rituals were a way to say, this is mine. Or at least, I've touched it. Some boundaries were marked by objects you couldn't see at all. A smooth black pebble placed under the doorstep. A chicken feather nailed inside the beam of a roof. One thatched hut has 7 broom bristles tied behind the door. Another has garlic hidden in the thatch, not for cooking, but to keep what's not welcome from crossing. And that's where it gets interesting. Because in the medieval world, the line between real and imagined danger was always thin. A fence might keep pigs out, but a bundle of dried thistles tied with red thread, that was for bad luck, for sickness, for envy. Not everyone believed in it, but almost everyone did it anyway, just in case. Even boundaries between people were managed with ritual. Shake hands with your left hand, and a baker won't sell to you again. Offer bread with your palm down, and you'll be remembered as stingy for a decade. These customs weren't law, but they were enforced, not with courts, but with stares, with silence, with exclusion. The wind rattles the branches in the woven fence as you walk back toward the village, and you can't help but think, maybe it's not the fence that protects the garden. Maybe it's the act of making it, the care, the intention, the belief that this patch of earth matters, even if no one else sees it. You move further up the path, where the ground slopes gently toward a row of mossy stones embedded in the grass. They look random at first, like the remnants of a crumbled wall or a lazy attempt at paving. But a woman walking beside you murmurs, "Don't step on them." She says it low and careful, like she's warning you about ice or fire. Those aren't stones. They're memory markers, places someone once stood, worked, or wept. No names, no carvings. Just the quiet understanding passed down in whispers. This is where something happened. So you step around them, even if you don't know why. Medieval people had 100 ways to make memory stick to a place. They planted yew trees beside wells. They wove bits of someone's clothing into the frame of a barn. They sang a certain song when leaving home, even if they were only going to the next village. To forget the song or the steps or the spot where you paused was to risk forgetting yourself. You round a corner and find yourself in front of an empty field with a single standing post at its centre. No sign, no use. It leans slightly, weather-worn, wrapped in what looks like dried reeds. A boy nearby explains that it's a tether post, but not for animals. It's where children used to be sent, giggling or scolded, when they disobeyed small things. Not tied, just told to go. And they'd wait, holding the post until called back in. Sometimes, he says, people go there on purpose. To reflect, to mark time, to remember the rules. It hits you how much of medieval life was anchored by invisible lines, not drawn with chalk or rope, but with action, repetition, and community agreement. You weren't told why, only shown what to do. Even seasonal boundaries were performed, not announced. At midsummer, villagers would walk the edge of their farmland carrying torches, chanting or humming as they moved, not because it lit anything, but because it traced the border, binding the land to their memory. Skipping the walk would be unthinkable, even dangerous. The wheat might fail, or the neighbours might talk. You glance down and realise you've been walking on a narrow trail of flattened grass for some time. No signs mark it, no fences flank it. Yet no one seems to stray from it. Not the chickens, not the children, not even the goats. The path has been made real by use alone. That's the essence of it, isn't it? In a world without maps or deeds or digital pins, the only way to fix a place in people's minds was to walk it, fence it, name it, or sing it. Over and over, until the custom became the line, and the line became law. And in many ways you're still inside those customs. They just wear different clothes now. But the need is the same, to protect what matters, even when no one else sees it. As the sun dips low and the light begins to blur the edges of the world, you look back at the post in the field, the path beneath your feet, and the invisible web that holds this place together. It's made of footsteps, memories, and rules unspoken, but obeyed all the same. You wake early the next morning, long before the cockerel starts his tired, ragged crow. Something's happening in the village square. There's a ripple in the air like the tension before a storm, not of fear, but of preparation. People are gathering, but not all at once. They come in trickles, some in heavy boots, others barefoot, some carrying bundles wrapped in linen. Children are kept close. No one speaks above a hush. And at the centre of it all, a small wooden bench has been turned on its side. A man steps forward, holding something in his arms. It looks like a loaf of bread. You blink, trying to make sense of it. The entire village is here to watch a piece of bread be placed gently onto the bench like it's a baby being christened. But then comes the salt, then the ashes, then the iron key. You're witnessing a shunning ritual, not the kind shouted from pulpits or declared in court. This is quieter, more intimate, and far more chilling. In the medieval world, formal punishments required landowners or bishops or sheriffs. But everyday discipline, that was communal, delivered through gesture and symbol, not words. The loaf represents nourishment, now withdrawn. The salt, purity, now tainted. The ashes, loss. And the key, it's turned upside down, meaning the door to reconciliation is closed. You finally understand. Someone has broken the custom, violated an agreement so old no one remembers who wrote it. But everyone feels when it's broken. It could have been anything. Using another's tools without asking, failing to show up for the harvest, spreading a rumour too far. No one names it aloud. That's not the point. This ritual isn't about vengeance. It's about removal. Not physical banishment, but silence, absence. No one speaks to the accused. No one sells to them. No one even makes eye contact. Their name disappears from gossip, jokes, and greetings. You think of the bundle of broom bristles tucked behind the door from earlier, of the fence woven with thistles and red thread, of the stone markers in the grass and the rowan branches tied above stables. All these things had meaning, but only because everyone agreed on what they meant, and now the same power is being used in reverse. You glance to the edge of the crowd and spot a woman standing alone, arms crossed tight. No one looks at her. No one nods. She's not bound in chains, yet it feels more final than any prison. This is a society built not just on survival, but on social weaving. And if the threads are frayed, they're clipped. Quietly. The ritual ends. The loaf is cut in half and left on the bench. One side crumbles in the wind. No one touches the other. Life resumes, almost immediately. Children dart off to chase chickens. A man hoists a sack onto his shoulder. A woman sharpens a knife. But that silence around her remains. A bubble no one dares pop. You're left wondering which is heavier, a sword, or the unbearable weight of being unseen. You walk a little slower after that. It's not just the strangeness of the ritual. It's the eerie way nothing feels strange to them. To you, it's a performance full of metaphor and mystery. To them, it's as clear as the moon's pull on the tide. Customs like that don't need explanation. They're soaked into the soil, passed through glances, not sermons. As you pass the market stalls, you begin to notice other quiet mechanisms of judgment. A trader lays out apples, but one is misshapen. She puts it at the back, not out of shame, but because there's a rule. You don't pass on a floor knowingly. That rule isn't written. You just know it, or you don't. And if you don't, you end up like the woman by the bench. At another stall, a boy tries to buy a skewer of roasted meat. He offers coin, but the seller shakes her head. He's done something slight but wrong. The seller doesn't explain. She just looks at him, and he drops his gaze. He walks away empty-handed, but not humiliated, just reminded. This is what makes medieval justice feel so alien to you. There's no trial, no verdict, but also no chaos. The worst punishment isn't pain, it's exclusion. And the only appeal is time, humility, and watching eyes. Later, while helping carry water back from the stream, you pass a small bridge, just 3 planks across a muddy gap. But a ribbon is tied to the rail, and everyone steps around it. You ask why. A girl whispers, because someone crossed it before they were forgiven. And that's all she says. It stuns you how powerful symbols can be in a world that treats them like stone. A ribbon is a rope, a glance is a gate, a bench becomes a wall. And yet, these things are so light, so gentle, they could blow away in a strong breeze. But they don't. because what holds them in place isn't wood or iron, it's shared belief. You think of the woman again, the one no one spoke to. You wonder how long it lasts. You wonder what she's thinking. You wonder if she's sorry or angry or just lonely. Maybe all three. Some shunnings end with reconciliation. Others don't, and no one speaks of them again. It's not written down. It just fades, but the customs remain, waiting for the next breach. Because more than laws or kings, custom is king here. The kind of king you can't see, can't hear, but feel all the same. As twilight returns and the hearths begin to glow through cottage shutters, you sense the village folding inward. The outer world, the woods, the fields, the sky, fades, and the inner world tightens. And at its centre isn't a throne, or a cross, or a sword. It's a bench, a loaf, a ribbon. That's the real power of medieval customs. They don't need to be enforced. They're lived, breathed, whispered. And if you forget them, the silence will remind you. You wake to the sound of bells, not grand cathedral bells, but the dull clang of iron tied to rope, swinging at the entrance of a barn. It's market day. And not just any market. It's midsummer's trading fair, where customs collide like wagons in a narrow lane. You follow the current of villagers moving toward the clearing. Tents rise like mushrooms overnight, bright with stitched sigils, scraps of ribbon, and dyed banners that flutter in the breeze. The air smells of ale, sheep, wet wool, and dried lavender crushed underfoot. You pass a merchant arranging sprigs of mugwort on her stall, not to sell, but to ward off theft. Because here, mugwort means, I'm watching. The plants aren't for profit, they're for protection. Like charms made of meaning, customs at the fair operate on their own strange rules. You see a young man try to sell a pair of shoes. A woman picks one up, turns it 3 times in her hand, and lays it back down without a word. He doesn't argue, he packs up his goods. You learn later that if someone turns your wares 3 times without buying, it's a silent judgment of fraudulence. No one else will touch them now. At a tent near the edge, a vendor lays out ribbons in colours you've never seen before. Blood ochre, bone white, a green so murky it looks like pond water. But when you go to touch one, she stops you, not with her hand, but with a phrase. Not yours to choose. Turns out, at this fair, certain colours are assigned by deed. Helped birth a lamb, you get blue. Built a roof, you get yellow. Lied and got caught, you wear brown. It's a strange badge system, invisible outside the village, but within, it dictates everything from where you sit during supper to who you dance with after sunset. As you weave through the market, it hits you that none of this is in a ledger. There's no handbook. No one hands out pamphlets at birth. But everyone knows the rules. And if you don't, you're a liability. You see it in the way people pass each other. 2 men lock eyes and touch their foreheads briefly with 3 fingers. Later, you learn they once quarrelled over pasture rights, and now use that sign to reaffirm peace every time they meet. That gesture didn't exist 10 years ago, but it will outlive them both. Because here's the twist. Medieval customs weren't just inherited. They were invented, constantly, spontaneously, by need, by accident, by whispered agreement, and once created, they hardened like ice in shadow. You find a stall offering carved spoons. One has a notch on the handle. You ask why. The seller replies, for second sons. That's all. No one needs more. You quietly slide the spoon back. You're not a second son. It dawns on you that identity here isn't told. It's shown through gesture, through object, through absence. You don't ask people who they are. You watch how they trade, how they greet, how they hang their laundry. At the centre of the fair, a platform stands empty. At noon, someone will step up and recite a nonsense rhyme. But it's not nonsense, it's the custom. A verse passed down with a twist each year. Whoever gets the loudest laugh wins a round of cider and the right to bless the fields. It's silly, it's chaotic, and it's binding. You sit by the edge, warmed by the sun and the sounds of barter and laughter and the low, ever-present hum of meaning behind every motion. You think of every odd little act you've witnessed since you arrived, and you realise they were never odd. Not here. They were a language. You just didn't know how to listen. The fair fades into gold as the sun begins to lean westward, and with it the hum of custom takes on a softer tone. You step around a pair of fiddlers tuning their strings. One of them wears 2 mismatched shoes deliberately. It's not poverty, it's tradition. A local joke, you're told. The fair fool must wear mismatched shoes so mischief knows whom to follow and whom to leave alone. If no one volunteers, misfortune picks its own target. You smile politely and glance down at your perfectly matched boots. Past the fiddlers, a group is forming a ring. It looks like a game, but when you move closer, you hear snippets of stories being traded like coins. Each person must tell one truth and one lie, woven together in such a way that the crowd roars with laughter if they can't tell which is which. But the winner isn't the best liar. It's the one who reveals something real through the lie. They call it confession without penance, custom born from nights when there were no priests, only neighbours. The sun touches the trees now, and a man begins to walk backward out of the clearing, dragging a broom made of thorn branches. A dozen people follow, also walking backward. They are sweeping the day away. You're told it ensures that no quarrels or curses cling to the village when the fair ends. Superstition? Perhaps. But you notice no one dares interrupt them. Not even the children. You find a quiet spot behind a barrel of salted herring and watch the last rituals unfold. A woman cuts 3 small notches into a wooden beam of her stall, today's profits. Not written in numbers, just in lines. It's how her grandmother did it, and her grandmother before that. And somehow, the wood remembers. A boy walks past with his arms full of goose feathers. He's grinning. Tomorrow morning, before anyone wakes, he'll leave a trail of them leading to the miller's door. Everyone will know what it means. The miller's daughter has been courted, but no one will say it aloud. To name it is to ruin it. This is a language of silence and symbols, of gestures passed like heirlooms. You think of all the strange customs you've stumbled through these past nights. The turnips carved to scare off spirits. The ink made from oak galls and iron, held sacred like blood. The left-handed greetings in fishing villages. The hand-fasting ropes braided from 3 households' wool. It's clearer now. Customs weren't rules. They were survival. In a world where laws were few, where kings were distant and justice was fickle, customs were the glue that held a village together. They taught who to trust, who to fear, who to marry, and who to avoid in the dark. They were born of necessity and layered with meaning, sometimes nonsensical, often unfair, but always binding. As the fair dissolves into shadows and embers, you walk the worn path back toward the village. You feel a pinch of hay in your boot. A child must have tucked it there. You smile. That means luck, apparently, unless it falls out before moonrise. And as the sky softens to indigo, one thought lingers in your mind. You didn't just witness strange customs, you were folded into them. And now, as the night wraps its arms around you, let it all soften. The strange gestures, the carved turnips, the silent glances and the broom-sweeping shadows from the fairground. Let them blur together like candle smoke curling in a still room. You've wandered through a world built not of logic but of layers, each custom a whisper from the past, gently reminding us how people made meaning before there were manuals, before laws were printed, before science measured every atom. A world where a ribbon could be a warning, and a bench could be a boundary. Where belief wasn't argued, it was lived. You don't need to remember every odd little rule from tonight. Just carry the warmth of knowing how deeply humans have always needed connection. Even when it looked peculiar, even when it made no sense, behind every custom was a need. To belong, to mourn, to love, to laugh in the face of winter. Let the symbols drift now. Let the turnips rot peacefully, the ribbons flutter, the stories settle. Sink into the hush of this moment. You're safe here. No one's watching. The fair is over, the fires are low, and even the village dogs have stopped barking. There's nothing left to do but rest. Let your breath slow, let your limbs go still, let the weight of the day roll off your shoulders like a borrowed cloak returned to the peg. And if you wake tomorrow with a straw in your shoe or a ribbon on your doorknob, well, maybe you dreamed your way into something older than you.